So when you talk about using constraints, is that purely range of motion restraints, or how do you kind of categorize that?
I think constraints is it's just setting up an environment for someone to be successful based on what I'm looking for the outcome of the exercise.
So, tell me a little bit about like what specific examples you've used in the past week or so, and how that more is applicable for an athletic population and how it was specific to that individual sport.
Yeah, so with constraints, there's an outcome that I'm trying to achieve. That's the first thing. So I'm basically looking at a skill that I'm trying to develop with an athlete, and I want to make it look exactly how I want it to look. And I think that's something Lee Taft says. He says just like create a drill so that it looks exactly how you want it to. And so, one example would be like like if you're trying to steal a base or you're doing a 60-yard dash and you have to do like a side start. So you're not facing the direction where you're sprinting. So you're facing sideways and you have to sprint to the right, for example. A lot of times with athletes, they have trouble orienting their body in the direction that they need to go to and getting themselves in a sprinting position quickly. And so, I think a big part of that is like they're afraid to like actually pick up their foot and put it under their center mass so that they can actually turn their hips in the direction where they're trying to go and turn into a sprinter at that point. So, what I'll do is you can use cones, you can use any kind of object. And basically what I'll do is I'll just say, hey, you have to get your foot outside of this thing. So like, for example, I'll have a bumper plate and they have to stand on the bumper plate. And then I'll say on go, you're gonna take off and sprint. And I want you to get your front foot behind the plate. So you can picture that they're stepping back off the plate and then they have to turn their hips to get around it. And so that they become a sprinter a little bit faster.
So if let's take that same example, it's a 60-yard dash or whatever, and they're going to turn and sprint to their right. They're standing on the bumper plate to start.
In this example that I'm giving, yes.
Yeah. And then what would be the sequence of steps from the bumper plate to the sprint?
Yes, you would, on go, you're going to put your left foot back behind the plate, and then you're going to bring your right foot under you with a nice low shin angle so that you're able to orient your body in the direction that you're trying to go.
Is the right foot also going off the plate?
Yeah. The right foot is coming off the plate and your hips are turning in that direction while you're on your left foot. So your hips are turning to the right while you're on your left foot so that you have enough time to put your right foot under you and create a nice ball of the foot contact onto the ground with a nice low shin angle, like you're coming off the blocks in a sprint start.
Right. So what did you see during your assessment or watching them sprint that caused you to put in these restraints?
Yeah, the main issue for me is they're trying to do this like crossover. Like they're trying to cross over and their hips aren't facing to the right. Like they're not facing the right direction. So instead of them becoming a straight ahead sprinter quicker, they're still trying to cut. And when you're trying to cut, right, you have to decelerate, you have to reaccelerate versus just being in straight ahead acceleration mode. So basically what I'm trying to do is turn them into a straight ahead sprinter in acceleration quicker.
It sounds like you're also taking away that like rotational component so that they don't cross over, and you're already squaring up their hips as they step their right foot back off the bumper.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, again, you're trying to create a better application of force in the right direction.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I like that drill. In terms of speed and agility and staying on, the conditioning side of our field, what are some other common restraints that you typically imply in your programs?
Yeah, so like a lot of times I'll watch the athletes and I'll notice something, and then I'm going to use the constraint to try to achieve the outcome that I'm looking for, like I said before. And so, like, for example, and this is something that I think is super common with younger athletes. Like, young guys, a lot of times they just aren't strong enough to achieve like these lower positions of the shins in particular with like a decent posture. You know what I mean? And so what you can do is you can decide, all right, we're either just not going to do that, or we can create a drill to try to work on that. So, let's say we want to work on like quick ground contacts. And so, what I might do is I might bring them up higher. So I might have them start on a plate, so they're actually elevated now, and then do like a falling start off of the plate. And that's just going to make it so they don't have to go into like such a low position, so they can work on quick contact times. So that might be like a constraint for a younger guy, just initially, to learn how to produce force a little bit quicker. And I think that's like really important for young athletes too, is working on speed and quick ground contact times. So that's one way I might do that. If we're talking about the other end of the spectrum, like acceleration posture, I like, you can do crouch starts, you can do like tall kneeling starts. Let's go with like a crouch start here. So an example I'll use is like a crouch start with a med ball chest pass.
Yeah.
So crouch start is like one foot in front of the other one. You're going to get your butt down really, really low. So you're putting them in a low position. And then I'll just instruct the athlete to, as they're taking off into their acceleration, throw the ball as far as they can up and out. So instead of me saying like, hey, I want you to position your body in this position, I'm going to say, hey, just throw the ball up and out, so that they're actually able to gradually increase their body angle and orient themselves in the right direction to apply force.
That's one that I commonly use as well, the crouch start get off sprints, tall kneeling and half kneeling get off sprints. I find that those are really useful for someone who is an upright sprinter, and they have the same position in their sprint as they would if they're jogging, which obviously is not ideal. So yeah, those are good exercises. I like those a lot. I need to start incorporating the med ball into it as well. I feel like that would help a lot with them getting accustomed to the momentum shift.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's like direction too. Like if I'm saying throw the ball up and out, that's creating that direction that I'm looking for.
Right.
Because a lot of times what you see is a lot of times I think it kind of just looks like they're crunching over. You know what I mean? They're trying to get up, but they don't have enough force into the ground yet. Like they don't have the ability to produce enough force into the ground to maintain those lower positions. So, they're compensating a lot. And so I think by using the ball, you're kind of giving them a little bit of not a cheat, but like you're showing them where they should go with their upper half. You know what I mean?
Right.
And then actually another way you can start to bridge the gap here, because with the med ball, what I find is, sometimes I've made this mistake. Like you'll have them throw the med ball, and then we're like, all right, let's get rid of the med ball. Let's do the crouch start without the med ball. And then their arms look like they're throwing a med ball, when they're taking off out of that position. So, one way I like to work on the arm action, and I don't even really consider it arm action. It's just what people call it. Like I think of it more as just like upper body, torso, trunk action, because it's really just like rotation, that like a little bit of a rotation, like a counter rotation that I'm looking for. I'll put 2 footballs like under the athlete's arm. So they're going to hold 2 footballs, and that just creates a little bit of that tighter arm action that I'm looking for. And also you'll see like a nice counter rotation of the torso. So yeah, usually I'll couple that, like those 2 drills together, and then we'll go to the crouch start. And for the most part, I think it usually looks better.
I like that a lot. Besides subjective analysis of their running, how else would you be able to interpret whether they're, force deficient versus like speed deficient.
So you mean like force and velocity profiles, like you were
Yeah,
talking about Tyler?
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you could do that with the med ball throws, like Tyler talked about. You could listen to, if you guys are interested in this, Tyler did a really good job on our last podcast about this. So if you want more detail on that, go back and listen to our last podcast. But, you know, you could do that with med ball throws at different weights, and you could see the distance or velocity on that. You could also do like a VBT. But I think a lot of the younger guys, like most of them just need strength, like a combination of speed and strength, you know? So, and it depends on age, but if they're, you know, if they're not like a senior in high school, for the most part, I think you just want to give them a mix of pretty much all the things. And that being said, you know, I'm always using the eye test, and I think the eye test is pretty valuable, especially if you're someone who's worked with younger guys for a while, because you can tell, like, you know, there's certain guys that are just, you know, there's a coordination thing going on, there's a strength thing going on. There's probably also like a conditioning thing going on in terms of deficiencies. And so, you know, you just try to match your training program with, you know, fitting whatever you think is going to be best for that guy.
There's one more restraint that I often use with my patients. I find that after someone is coming back from any sort of like lower body injury and they're finally able to start running and sprinting again, they almost always have these small choppy steps, almost like they're afraid to reach out in front of them and just explore like ranges outside of their center of mass. So what I've been doing is using flat cones and having them hit their foot in between the flat cones, so spread them out like a couple feet apart so that they're forced to increase their stride length and not take these small choppy steps. Have you used something like that in the past? Do you find that useful?
So, I mean, I don't use it. I've definitely heard of people using it, you know. Um, is there like a certain yardage that you're doing that with?
No, not particular. Maybe up to 2 yards.
Oh, you mean between the cones?
Yeah, right.
I meant like, is this like the total yardage of the sprint?
Oh, it's
Like,
usually no more than 20.
okay, so it's like a 20-yard sprint.
Yeah.
Um, I'm trying to like visualize it. Like, so I'm almost picturing like, it would look kind of like a bounding drill in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I don't know. I don't know. I just haven't used it, I guess. But, you know, you're right. Like stride length is a big one. It's just, I don't know if that's something we can like affect. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if that's gonna, and I don't even know if any of these drills are gonna like directly affect the way they do it in the game. You know, sometimes I think about that. I'm like, is this drill that is so far removed from the sport actually gonna correlate with their in-game stuff? You know what I mean? And then so a lot of times I'll do the drill and then I'll do like a med ball drop and I'll see if it translates. And I will say for the most part, like if the athlete is just learning this thing, and like let's say, you know, I do a drill with a few constraints and they successfully achieve the outcome that I'm looking for, and then directly go to the ball drop, I'll say like 9 times out of 10, they still don't do, you know what I mean? They still don't do what I'm looking for.
Yeah. I think part of it is if we do see that adaptation that we're looking for in the drill itself, I think a lot of that is just the learning effect. The other piece too is, going off of what you said about we're unsure whether or not these drills are actually affecting their play within their sport. I feel like it just adds a different variation, a different stimulus, so that they are just more able to perform it if that does happen in a game. If they have to take an awkward step outside of their center of mass, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's creating a more well-rounded athlete would be the thought, right?
For sure.
So, I mean, I do think like if you find a drill that looks good, maybe the best approach might be to stick with that thing for a while if you're really trying to make a change. If you've, and I like what you said before, like how do you actually determine whether that's something that they need to do? I think it's like a combination of, watching like the best do things, and then also just understanding the athlete's like body type. You know what I mean?
Yeah, this is pretty complicated stuff, and I think unless you have the experience and the eye to look for certain things, it's hard to justify throwing it into your program.
Yeah, but I still think it's good to talk about because it gets you
100%.
thinking about it all. And
Yeah,
like, for example, a lot of times you can look at like what the highest level coaches are doing with things. And I think the best ones are the ones that watch, the best guys perform, and they look at what they do and they say, well, okay, what does this guy do? What does this guy do? What does this guy do? And then they find commonalities. And so like that's usually what I go off of is like, all right, these are things that pretty much everyone needs to do. And then you have to decide like, okay, why is this guy not doing this? Is it just like a coordination thing? Is it a strength thing? Is it a speed thing? Does he have a previous injury, like you said? And a lot of times it can be a combination of all of them. And then it's like, to me, it's like, let's not force this guy into doing something that, could potentially put him at risk. You know what I mean? That's like the first thing. Okay, let's check that box. You know what I mean? Let's make sure this doesn't put the guy at risk, right?
right.
But then it's also just like, all right, this is kind of like a video game. You're right now you're a 11-year-old athlete and you're on level 1. You haven't mastered any of the skills to go on to level 2. So let's teach you how to do some things just a little bit more efficiently based off of what everyone needs to do. And really it's based off of physics, to be honest. Like I think human movement, especially in sports, it's all physics. Like we talk about, it's center mass, it's base of support, it's application of force in the right direction. And so, I'm always looking at those things. And I can tell you like what it comes down to for me a lot of the time is really just, I'm trying to affect the physics of this thing based on the person's body type in front of me, and sometimes it's gonna, and actually all the time, I shouldn't just say sometimes, but athlete to athlete, it's gonna look a little bit different. But, if you are optimizing the physics and the way the athlete is reacting with the ground, then, I think you're doing your job.
Yeah, that's so true. Actually, one of my favorite classes in college was physics of the human body.
Yeah.
It was extremely difficult because you were working with equations and ground reaction forces and joint reaction forces and angles of pull. But I mean, it was very applicable, obviously. And I think that was a really good point what you just said, because it's true. I mean, everything that we do has a likewise reaction to it that's opposite. So
Yep. Yep.
um it's, for me at least, I always get so excited when I start to work with someone who, like you said, is, um, a biological training age of practically 0 or 1. It's just super exciting to see their results come so quickly, because we know that the lower they are, the lower their start, the faster they progress through those initial levels. After that, obviously it takes a little bit longer just because they're more trained. But that's one of the reasons why I love working with teenagers, because a lot of them, they're just have not been exposed to what we're talking about outside of their sport.
Yeah. You know what I was just thinking about is like, how do you approach the amount of things you want to teach someone in one session, especially if it's like a new person.
Yeah.
And so like, because here's what happens sometimes, and I do this all the time. Like, if I'm running like a speed and agility class and all these guys in front of me are totally new, they've never done anything with me, everything I'm doing, I'm going to provide like 1 or 2 big points. Like, let's say it's a shuffle, all right, we're gonna pretend there's a low ceiling over our head. Don't hit your head on the ceiling. This is your starting position, feet wider than your shoulders, right? Nose over toes. And then we're gonna push with the back foot and pull with the front foot. And that's kind of where I'll go with that. And we'll drill it, and we'll see if guys get it. And I'll look for like a few things, like, here's what most of the guys are doing wrong. Like, let's focus on this thing. Keep your head under that low ceiling. Maybe that's what it is, right? And we'll keep going and keep going and keep going. And then, maybe we did that for like 5-10 minutes, and then we move on to the next thing. Okay. But, we did like 6 different things. Like, these guys learned like 6 things in this session. And then the next time I see him, I'm like, all right, who remembers how to shuffle? Yeah, like there's always that one kid, he's like this, and he remembers like 1 or 2 of the things, what I mean? But he doesn't remember all the things. Yeah. And so, the question in my head is like, how many things should you emphasize in a session? And then, should you layer stuff? Like, should it be like, all right, like, we're gonna work on just moving in that direction today, like shuffling or something, right? So maybe you do like, you start with basic shuffles, and then you use a more involved drill, you apply some constraints, and then you go into more of like a ball drop, open skilled environment. Maybe they're able to master in that session, or do you just teach them a bunch of different things? What's your opinion on all that? I know that was a lot.
That was a lot, but it was all really good. I think as coaches, we often try to do too much in one session. And I don't know if it's because, and I've done it too, I don't know if it's because we're trying to prove our worth, or if we think that they'll hold on to all this information and learn it right away. But, number one, like to your point that you just made, they're kids. How much are kids really going to remember based on what we do? But the second thing, I don't know if I would have done 6. I read something interesting the other day from a coach, and it was, I had a training session that was an hour, 45 to 60 minutes long, but I only did 3 movements, but I did a good amount of volume with high quality repetitions of those 3 movements. I think there's a lot to be said there. Obviously, this is different in terms of context. 45 to 60 minutes of pure sprinting and plyos is much different than lifts. But
I fully agree with you. And I was just making this example to bring up a discussion, because I don't know if either one is right. And I think sometimes it depends. Like,
it always depends. Yeah.
And I'll tell you the way I do it. Like, the first session, when someone is totally new with me, I'm going to show them like all the stuff. Because honestly, I just want to pique their interest, and I want to keep their mind going. You know what I mean? And I don't want to get them bored. And hopefully, I already know what my training program is going to look like for the most part. There's going to be minor changes, but I already know for the most part what it's going to look like. And I'm just trying to kind of show them like all these different cool things, that you're going to be able to do. Right. And so like in the first session, I think you just expose them to a bunch of things. This is just my opinion. It could be wrong, but if like we're just doing one thing, and yeah, there's a difference between 1 and 6, right? But, I think, pique their interest, and then in that next session, like, hey, we're going to work on this today. And then we're going to layer on top of that one thing. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, I'll teach acceleration one day, right? And I'll talk about getting these good angles, and I'll show them the angles, like what they should look like. Here's your shin angle, here's your trunk angle. And I'll show them it, and then we'll use a drill to try to achieve it. And then we'll do like a different position. And then I'll say, but then after you've done your, let's call it a plyo step from a side start, you're in that same acceleration angle, So it just becomes like a layer on top of a skill that they've learned.
Yeah. I think I do the same thing for my first session, because, as we know, if they haven't actually bought yet, you have to kind of sell them and make them buy into what you're doing with them. So, I will definitely do different things on their first session, but almost always I test.
Yeah,
I'll test jumps, I'll test lateral bounds, and just highlight like, hey, you know, your left side of the lateral bound is 5 inches less than your right. That's something that we need to address. You know, like I recently started working with a college tennis player at my facility, and that's one of the things, right? Where we did top end sprint speed, we did lateral bounds, we did broad jumps, and then just a basic pull up and push up test. And you know that's a little bit of everything, right? That's strength, it's um, force production. We did a 5-10-5 shuttle for agility, and none of those things are really. I mean, they intertwine with one another, but I would kind of work my sessions with her differently if I knew that I had more than one.
for
So,
sure.
you know, so for example, like you said, one day you'll work on just acceleration and then layer on it, right? Like one day for me, I would work on top end sprint speed and then layer that with the exercises that are gonna um, facilitate higher top end sprint speed.
100%. Yeah, I love that. And that's a great environment for learning because then, yeah, you're really just drilling that one thing. And honestly, that's how I train. And for me, it helps because I feel like I get a greater transfer, I guess, in terms of the outcome that I'm trying to achieve with that session. But, you know, the other thing to think about is, are you doing too much volume on that one thing? You know, that's the other question you have to ask. Like, now that we're working this one joint position for a full hour, you know, are we doing too much, right? And I think it can also be dependent on the person in front of you. And obviously, we're speaking about extremes here. Like, you know, we're just doing one thing or we're doing six things. You know, there's obviously some stuff in the middle of the road there. And you're going to have to manipulate speed. You're going to have to manipulate load. You're going to have to play around with those things. And maybe part of it is training age. Like maybe with the really young guys, you know, you're showing them this thing and you're trying to teach the one skill, but you're doing it in a lot of different ways. So it's not a ton of stress on one area. And I do think that's kind of what you're saying. Um,
It is. And again, it depends on the person, right? The answer is always it depends, which is frustrating but insightful at the same time because it makes us get better at what we do. So, for example, when we were working on her sprint speed, um, I had her do a 10-second sprint on the air runner. So that gave her a good amount of time to accelerate. And then, you know, a minute and 30 minutes, sorry, a minute and 30 seconds of rest in between. And then the air runner has your miles per hour on it. So when she started to drop consistently under a half mile per hour, that's when I'm like, all right, that's good. For her, it turned out to be 8 reps. For someone, you know, and she's pretty well trained prior to her coming to me. It just wasn't very balanced. For example, she's a tennis player, so she needs a lot of agility and a lot of lateral movements. And, you know, we started doing like some hurdle drills, and she's very velocity deficient. Pretty strong, but very velocity deficient. And you could just tell putting her in these drills. But like for example, if she had come to me a couple of years ago before being so well trained, it might have been cut off at 4 reps or 5 reps.
mm,
So I think that just illustrates like you need to be as data driven as possible and obviously use your eyes as well. I mean, if fatigue starts to set in and you can visually see something failing, then cut it. But I like to be as specific as possible with objective data.
yeah, I love what you're saying. I think the big thing that I took away from what you said was like, you know, use your eyes and use your judgment and be willing to move on in real time, especially if it's just like one person, or maybe if you're in a group and you notice everyone's super tired. Hey guys, go get a drink of water. You know, let's take a 3-minute break. You know,
Yeah.
and come back and then coach them up on some stuff. And then, you know, you've taken your 3-minute break and work back into it. And it's like, all we're talking about right now is this is like one session, you know. I guess the next question would be, where do you go? Where do you go for more than one session? Like, how do you build a program? And so, I don't know, what are some of your big rocks, Pete, to make sure that you're not overdoing it, and you're also getting the outcome that you're desiring?
Sure. So as I mentioned, she's a college tennis player, and I actually didn't realize this, but women college tennis players, their season is in the fall. And I'm glad I asked her that because I was under the impression that it was a spring sport, and apparently she told me that men's tennis plays in the spring, women's plays in the fall. That might have been something that changed because of COVID. I don't know. But anyway, I'm glad I asked because I assumed her sport was in the spring. So I assumed, I'm like, oh shit, I have, 6 to 8 weeks to get her into sport specific shape. Obviously, that's going to look a lot different than now that we have more time. Now we're in a true off season block. Now we have 6 months to get her to that sport specific shape. So again, right now, I think she is pretty well trained, but she still needs some more balance in her training. So introducing her to low level plyometrics like small hurdle jumps, lateral bounding, and some basic box jumps and altitude landings. That's already mixed into her program because I think she needs to learn how to do those things better. But it's off season still, right? So we are still working on strength. We are still working on speed strength. She hasn't done any Olympic lifting. She really hasn't done any sort of like jumping work. So we're going to do some modified Olympic lifts. And then we're going to do like, squat jumps with the trap bar, with dumbbells, things like that. But for her program, she's coming in 4 times a week. I'll get a little bit more specific. I'm sorry.
Okay.
We're going to split it up into 2 upper days and 2 lower days with those plyometrics and dynamic movements at the beginning of her session. So my skeleton is almost always the same with everybody that I see. They do their mobility drills first, their activation sets, their dynamics and plyos, and then they get into the actual strength portion of their workout, followed by if they have conditioning at the end or a cool down.
Got it.
So for example, today I'll give you what we did today. So she came in, she did her hip mobility drills, her trunk mobility drills, so thoracic rotation, and then some activation sets for her rotator cuff and lower traps. And then she did kneeling plyo push-ups, 3 sets of 3. And then she did some scoop toss rotational med ball throws. Right, so that was her dynamic portion. Then she just did a push pull day, like your traditional push pull day. Some conditioning on the rower at the end, and then that was it.
Nice. I like it. I think
Simple. We have a lot of time.
So I guess there's just one thing I'd like to add, because I think this will provide some insight for those listening. Pete's laying out a really good like single day template, and I think you did a good job. Like, you did a good job talking about, like, you're in the off season, so you have time to think about what's going on. But so like when I write stuff, the first thing I do is I'm like, all right, here's the timeline that we're looking at. What are my key performance indicators? Like, what are we really working on? You talked about that with her. She's velocity deficient, so how are we going to shift that profile in that direction? So that's a big one. Another big one is just like based off of your testing. If this is just a one-on-one, like you're gonna say, okay, let's work on this thing in terms of your range of motion and your movement quality. But then also, like, what's the phase goal? Like, what are the phases that I'm going to take this person through? And then the first thing I always do is like, here's the phase goal. Like, here's 1 or 2 things, maybe even 3 sometimes. Like, what are the phase goals that we're working on? And then you're going to put those things down. And then from there, in a weekly format, I'm just thinking about muscle groups. I'm thinking about the intensity of the session. And then that's really, those are the 2 big ones. Just muscle groups, intensity of the session. Oh, and then also probably like we're gonna look at like what we're trying to achieve from that session. You know what I mean? Whether it's, like speed, strength, hypertrophy, endurance, just general categories of fitness or performance, right?
Yeah.
So that's probably how I'll break it up in a week. And you just want to make sure that the intensity is not like high for a bunch of days in a row, or you're not like crushing the same muscle groups for a bunch of days in a row.
Right.
And so, and then the other thing is just like, if your phase goal is speed, let's have like most of the volume be reflective of that. So let's not focus every single day on hypertrophy. Let's not spend 10 sets on hypertrophy and 3 sets on speed in one day. So, and then to me, that's just like kind of how you have to start the whole thing, because I've fallen into the trap of like, on a day-to-day, just majoring in the minors and saying like, this thing doesn't look, let's just work on this one thing. And then we've only done one thing, and you're right. Like you gotta have a mixture of all those things. And so I guess that's how I think you can lay things out from a maybe like bird's eye view, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and again, I'm a big advocate of testing. So the tests that we did were obviously pull-ups, push-ups, broad jump, lateral bounds, top end sprint speed, and then a 5-10-5 shuttle. And then we did basic anthropometrics, weight, body fat, and tape measurements, because she does have a goal of reducing body fat, losing weight, and becoming more lean, which makes sense, right? Again, with athletes that have a lower training age, you're likely going to see improvements in those testing, in that testing. I don't want to say no matter what you do, but as long as you have a solid program with good balance, you're likely going to see improvements in those things. Now, again, like Tyler said, he tested every 8 weeks. That's probably what I'm going to do. I'm thinking I'm going to test every 6 weeks with her, at least in the beginning, so I know that we're moving in the right direction. When those results are not as apparent, or when they come to a stop, that's when I'm going to be a little bit more specific with the programming. But for now, I think, she has a relatively low training age. She will benefit automatically just from coordination, low level plyometrics, and a more of a balanced training program than she's done in the past, because it was unguided before. And I'm going to check myself and continue to retest every couple of weeks and just make sure that things are improving.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. I like what you said about the goal too, because that'll be the backbone of the pro. Like the goal of the client or the trainee or the athlete or whatever you want to call them is probably the first thing. And then also just like, you got to do a needs analysis for their sport. Like, these are the things that they need for their sport.
Right.
And you got to prepare them for those things.
Like intuitively, we want to make every person like the catalyst of their sport, right? Just because that's what we want to do. But sometimes that's not their first goal. Like, her first goal was, I want to be more lean and feel like I can move better. Right. And for her, that means something a lot different than like, all right, yes, I got like a fresh new athlete, a different sport than I'm used to coaching. So it's just so important to like ask those questions about goals in that first session.
Yeah, and I think lucky for us, like most sports involve getting in shape, and things are generally gonna go in the direction of less body fat and more muscle mass in that case. So
There's
like,
quite a few common denominators for sure.
yeah, and you probably have a good chance of explaining that to most people if you're somewhat intelligent. But that being said, I think you can also do things where people are like, like, why are we not doing this exercise when this is the one that everyone says builds muscle, and that's really my goal here? You know what I mean? So maybe it just becomes something where, you have to give the client some of what they want, and also some of what you need. And you just have to balance it. Like, even if you think that exercise is like terrible for that person, maybe you just sprinkle it in, and then balance it out with other things that you think are going to be able to kind of bring them back to really what you're looking for.
I think the joke, the best thing that, not the best thing, but one thing that I've gotten really good at over my years of coaching is sneaking in exercises and stimuli that I want in their program without them knowing.
Yeah, yeah. And so the other thing is like I think when you train like older people who have done a lot of things and probably had a few coaches or just like have some like associated emotion with certain exercises, you have to you have to be good at, I guess, like describing why you're choosing that thing, you know, because otherwise they're just going to be like, what the hell am I doing? You know?
Right.
And sometimes I'm like, I'll just tell people, I'm like, hey, if you don't like this exercise, just tell me and we'll change it. Like, I really don't care. Like that's why you got to lay out like your phase goals in my head. You know what I mean? Because what matters more is that you're actually going by the structure of the program that you've set up to prepare this person for their goal, and also what they're going to need in their sport or in life. And so the exercises on a day-to-day basis, yes, they matter for sure, and they need to be reflective of like someone's available range of motion. But it doesn't matter if you squat with a kettlebell or a dumbbell, or and like it matters to some degree. Like don't get me wrong, I'm not going to say that there's no difference, because there's definitely a difference. But like if someone's like truly complaining about something, I'm not just going to sit there with this person in a bad mood and force them to do something. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, they're paying to come see us. So I always tell people, hey, if you don't like what we're doing, let me know, and I will change it for you. I have no problem doing that.
Yeah.
And more oftentimes than not, if you have any experience in this field, something that's very similar, and hopefully your client well enough to know that they're going to like whatever you choose.
For sure. Let's spend a few minutes and let's talk about constraints in the weight room.
Sure.
We talked a good amount about doing conditioning drills and speed and agility and acceleration drills. But let's talk about how we can apply this to the weight room as well, because I think that's really important, in particular with younger athletes who are new to weights.
Mm-hmm.
So besides like your usual like range of motion restraint, if you know that someone can't touch your toes, then you probably won't have them deadlift from the floor. Um, there's hundreds of examples that you can pick from. If you see someone do your traditional butt wink, then maybe not have them squat so low. But what are other common restraints that you use? And I know it's another it depends answer, but I do feel like there are a few common denominators across the board that we often utilize.
No, yeah, for sure. I think a lot of times you're just eliminating the effects of gravity, like when it comes down to it, because what happens is the less stability you have, the more likely it is that you're going to compensate and do something that is maybe not favorable based on your definition. So like, if you lie someone on their back, that's probably a position of the most stability. So if there's something that you've decided you want to work on, let's say it's like, shoulder flexion, you want to go through an overhead motion, and you don't want them to compensate by overextending, then you just lay them on their back and teach them how to go through that range of motion while feeling their back on the ground. That right there, the ground has become a constraint. And it's easier to do it on the ground because you have more stability. So you're reducing the influence of gravity.
Yeah, makes sense.
And then, what you do is you once you feel like that person's capable of moving on from that position, you decrease the stability and you increase the load. And so now you have two ways to make things harder. You can even increase the speed if you feel like you need to. And that's really how that thing goes. I think, there's definitely more than one way to do it. That's probably like the biggest one that I can think of, unless someone has like a, significant injury. And then, maybe it's just like they're afraid to do something, and so they do it really, really poorly. But really the constraints just become things that I think for the most part are going to reduce the influence from gravity. I don't know. What's your opinion?
Yeah, I agree. And I'm going to speak to this from a pain perspective. So I'm going to put my PT hat on for a couple minutes.
Okay.
One of the most common injuries that I work with are shoulder pathologies, particularly labral tears.
Okay.
And so, common things that I work on with people with labral tears are the strength of their upward rotators of the scapula, right? So if they can perform more work, that's going to be less stress on the shoulder joint itself and more work kind of aimed towards the scapulothoracic joint. So, the three muscles that we work on, the three upward rotators are the serratus anterior, upper traps, and lower traps. So, Y raises are how we can best isolate the lower traps. Ideally, you want to do that against gravity, so like in a prone position. However, that is not always going to be utilized with someone who is in pain because it's just not going to feel good. So, a constraint that we often utilize is just changing their position so that it's a pain-free um, scapular plane motion. So we'll do tall kneeling, and then we'll kind of break it down into like an incline, like laying on an incline bench and doing it there. Then we can do like an incline position from a physio ball, and then just progressively work your way down into that prone position. That would be a way that I use constraints from a pain perspective. But if you break that down, like what are you actually changing? Yeah, you're changing stability a little bit with the bench versus the physio ball, but mostly you're changing the impact of gravity. You're going from upright to incline to at some point completely horizontal.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page then.
Yeah.
We're trying to reduce the influence of gravity. I think that's really what it comes down to me. I wish I had more to say. I feel like, you know, maybe the best thing we could do is give examples. Why don't we? So I think that was a good one with the shoulder raise, right? Maybe you could talk about a squat. So like, I think the most basic example, how can I reduce the influence of gravity with a squat? Let's do a roller against the wall or a stability ball against the wall. I think a roller is better because it doesn't like just push you forward. But what you can do is you just push everything against the wall. Now all of a sudden you're learning to go straight up and down like you're in an elevator instead of like hinging your butt way back in your squat, if that's what you are trying to achieve for your squat, a more vertical descent, more deep knee dominant motion. And then you can just slowly reduce the stability. So from the wall, maybe we go to a cable counterbalance squat. So you're holding something in front of you, so you're able to shift your weight back. Keep, again, more of that knee dominant pattern where you're going straight up and down versus shooting your butt back. And maybe you're able to layer on the cueing. So you say, pretend that the roller's against your back when you're doing this cable counterbalance squat. So now they're able to transfer that same strategy into an environment that has less constraints and more of an influence from gravity. So then after we're done with the cable counterbalance squat, maybe we reach a medicine ball in front of us or a plate in front of us and do a squat, right? So you still have a lot of counterbalance, but it's not quite as much as from the cable. So, we're slowly, again, decreasing stability, increasing the influence from gravity, which is going to require more force production. And again, if you've done this entire progression with me, I'm going to tell you, pretend your back is against that roller as you're going up and down. And so they have that in their head. They have the image of that in their head as the exercise is getting more difficult. And then maybe we go to a goblet squat, right, with something a little bit closer to the body, and you can load it up a little bit more heavily, but it's still in front of you. So, you're still going to get a little bit of that counterbalance. And then we work towards a more difficult environment, and there's everything in between these things, right? So it's not like it has to be this exact progression. You know, a lot of times I like box squats for this too, for certain people, because not everyone's going to have like the range of motion to do it, or at a certain range of motion, they just tend to compensate more than someone else. And that's where you could do like, you know, you sit to the box, sit your weight back. And then when you stand up like you have that roller against your back. Don't stand up and dump everything in front of you, right? So you can use that box to get that relaxation in between the downward and upward phase of the squat. So that might be another good one. And then, yeah, like, you know, once we've done goblet squats, we can move on to like kettlebell rack squats, like 2 or 1. You can even go to like a front squat. And so, you know, that's getting pretty advanced there, and you can really load up that thing. And with every variation, you just have that image in the back of your head of, you know, you have that roller against your back. And what happens when we've gone through this progression, maybe the exercise you've done in the previous phase, in the previous progression, is in your warm-ups, right? So, you know, like we did the roller squat and you're in the counterbalance squat for your exercise. We're doing it with a specific tempo, but the roller squat kind of just stays in the warm-ups, and then you have that direct relationship between the two exercises. So it's a little bit easier to learn and get the same outcome.
The more you were talking, the more I realized that changing position of the load is a constraint in itself.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking immediately to one of my hockey players who has a hip labral tear from a cam lesion, which is very common in the hockey population. And it's interesting that you're giving these examples, because when he's in his lifts with his team, his hip hurts when he back squats, but his hip has no pain when he front squats. So that's a restraint, that's a constraint right there.
Yeah.
Just changing the position of the load so that it's pain free and more comfortable.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, dude, I think that's the name of the game a lot of times.
Yeah, finding what works for the person in front of you.
Yep. And so, you know, you're just trying to find out more information. That's what the eval is for. But you're never going to get everything just from laying them down. You got to watch them actually move and see if they can actually go through those ranges with what you deem to be appropriate technique. And sometimes it just comes down to either regressing the amount of influence from gravity, so decreasing that thing, or repositioning the load, or putting a different constraint in, like a box in a box squat, and stopping them at a specific range of motion. And you just kind of, from our perspective, need to try to understand like what is the outcome that you're driving, and what is the outcome that you would like to get from the exercise. Because there's a different outcome with a dumbbell goblet box squat than there is with a full range of motion cable counterbalance squat with tempo.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, because the box you're putting at a different position because of the actual contraction mode, like, you know, where you are pausing, where you're stopping, where there is going to be like more of an overcoming effect. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of different things to think about. That's why I love this stuff, is because I love playing with these things and trying to find the best exercise for someone, which, you know, how often do we actually find that thing, you know?
Depends on who you are, right?
And, you know, earlier in this podcast, I said, it doesn't even really matter about the exercise. I didn't say that. I didn't say that. I said, I think the most important thing is starting with that, you know, goal assessment, needs analysis, and working backwards. But again, I really do believe that there is a best. I do believe there is a best. And, you know, the best practitioners are going to get closer to it, you know?
I agree.
That's why we keep talking about this stuff and trying to learn. So,
Yep, I agree. Well, that was a really insightful episode. That was awesome.
yeah, I loved it.
I think we covered a lot of good things there.
Me too. Me too. We're capping it here. It feels like it's a good way to stop.
Yeah, I think so. I think we touched everything we needed to. We talked about speed, agility, acceleration, top end sprint speed, restraints with conditioning practices, and then we finished with constraints in the weight room.
Yep.
Cool. Nice. Well, Thank you for listening to Coach Train Compete, a podcast for performance. I'm your host, Pete Insorello.
Drew Coben. I like how the name has Pete in it at the end now. Compete.
That was on purpose.
That's what I like about
Pretty
it.
sure you came up with that name, so I'm blaming you.
No, I know. I didn't realize that until now because you said coach train compete, and then you said with your host Pete, and I was like, oh, that's pretty cool.
That is cool.
That's the weird shit I like, I guess.